So we're here at the Resolution Foundation today. We've just published a report on energy bills and particularly the role that levies have played in energy bills. So we wanted to delve into that a little bit. I'm joined by Johnny Marshall, Principal Economist here at the Resolution Foundation and author of today's report, and also by Adam Scorer, Chief Executive of the National Energy Action, a charity that works and campaigns across England, Wales and Northern Ireland to eradicate fuel poverty. So really looking forward to getting into this with you both and digging under the detail a little bit. We're just emerging from a cost of living crisis where household bills have played a huge role, and energy bills in particular. Johnny, what's happened to energy bills over the last few years? Where do we stand and how much do people notice it?
So energy bills were relatively stable for quite a long time going into the energy crisis. Prices were going up, but how much energy people were using was going down. So that meant bills were relatively steady on average over quite a long time, but then overnight the cost of energy basically doubled. And there was no way that people could cut back enough or should cut back enough to accommodate that. And that meant that energy bills shot way up, the sort of causes of the squeeze on households. Right at the top now with sort of housing costs and food prices in terms of the biggest outlays that people have. But while the energy crisis, the sort of causes of it have sort of potentially calmed down a little bit, energy bills have not gone back to where they were. So, before the crisis, energy bills were sort of £1,100 or so per year. Now we're looking at sort of £1,700, £1,800 a year. And this is, in real terms, accounting for inflation, that's a quarter, 25% increase. And this means the families are still feeling the squeeze from energy bills. We see that, polling out a few weeks ago showed that energy bills are the sort of main driver of worries over the cost of living, up there with food, and that a lot of people are preparing to respond in ways which aren't ideal this winter. So, more than half of people said they would not put the heating on as much as they should do, which is obviously a big issue for a lot of people. And about 4 in 10 say they were looking to just use heating less, they'd be a bit colder, which again is some people can bear that, but a lot of people shouldn't have to be colder. And looking slightly to the future, so there doesn't seem to be any real downward pressure on bills coming. The last price cap was virtually flat on the one before, up 2%, but in April, it's expectations that energy bills could go up by about £100 a year. So there's no sort of short-term ease in sight. So energy, and that is why energy bills remain such an important topic.
So we've come through the kind of what people call a cost of living crisis after Russia invaded Ukraine, but that level of prices is still really biting on families. Does that chime with your experience, Adam?
Yeah, absolutely. So through the peak of the volatility in the global gas price, supercharging of the cost of living crisis, but Johnny says the prices are still going to be £600 higher than they were pre-crisis, so that cost of living crisis doesn't feel like it's shifted at all for our client groups and our clients, so those on the lowest incomes struggling the most. A couple of things about it are, one, in some ways it's a periodic threat. So especially for those who pay by bills, for those people who pay prepayment, you pay what you need when you use it, and you're very exposed over winter. But for everybody else, it's this periodic panic and fear element of it coming on, and that represents itself every day in the sorts of decisions that you make about how you heat the home, how you wash your clothes, do your kids get out of bed to go to school because they hate being in the cold too much. What we would see in our client group is this just explosion, one where debt, £4.5 billion of household energy debt, and the rest, I think, how that is such a kind of persistent fear in people's budgets. But then just the daily behaviours that we would see, the persistence of mental health conditions exacerbated by cost of living pressures, washing your kids' clothes, having a hot bath, living in more than one room, all those sorts of things are just such a persistent stress on households, as well as the transactional issues of making budgets work.
Yeah, really vivid examples of how it bites, and that debt issue we looked at recently as well, and just you sort of see actually slight reductions in consumer debt overall, but energy bills have completely taken off as a place where people are in debt with potentially very worrying consequences.
And concentrated on the lowest kind of
Yeah.
incomes, of course, and it intercepts that ability to have conversations or supporting mechanisms about other things, because you've got to get across this huge hurdle first of all, and that's very, very difficult to do. So the cost of living crisis, it's live.
Yeah.
It has huge secondary impacts, which can be difficult to get through to policymakers: sociability, educational achievement, physical development, ill health, all those sorts of issues, and we're at the same time we're losing that very useful laser focus on cost of living as that peak of volatility disappears. So it's really important that now that we're able to focus back in what's driving policy, what's driving energy costs, what government can do about it, and what impact you're looking to have on those who are least able to shoulder the burden.
Yeah, so let's come to that. Why have costs risen so much? And we've heard a lot about gas prices, but we heard yesterday energy bosses at the Select Committee saying that government levies have played a big role too. And Johnny, your report breaks that down in terms of gas and electricity. So what do you find in terms of the role of government levies in these price rises?
Yeah, so we looked at what had happened to real, so inflation-adjusted energy bills over the past 10 years, and you see that they've gone up for both gas and electricity. But for gas, most of that increase is because gas is more expensive. So about 70% of the cause of higher bills is buying more expensive gas and burning more expensive gas, which makes inherent sense. But for electricity bills, that share is much smaller. So the sort of the fuel cost element, which is in electricity mainly due to the cost of gas, that's then burnt to generate electricity, that only accounts for about a third of the cost increase over the past decade. A much bigger proportion, nearly half of the overall cost increase is what is the pressure that's been put on bills through levies, schemes, policies that have all been added to different parts of energy bills to do different parts of policy, all individually well-meaning, but over the decade that bills have been used in this way, we've seen that this is a big driver of bills being more expensive on electricity bills especially.
So we've actually got quite significant rises there, over half of the rise in electricity coming from these levies, and there's, as you say, Johnny, there's lots of them, and the report has a really useful page that kind of spells out what they all are. But overall, how much are they? How much have they gone up?
So at the moment, the sort of combined total of levies generally on gas and electricity bills is just over £250. And these are things that they fund social policies, so they help with what's the warm home discount, which gives people a rebate on their bills during the winter, certain people. Helps with government-funded efficiency schemes, and they help with sort of ways to make the energy system greener. But while that's £250, worthwhile causes, 10 years ago, this was the cost of this was about £100.
Yeah.
So we've had, what is effectively a tax on people, on bills. You can't not pay this. That has more than doubled in real terms over the decade. And that's not really something else you'd get away with in other parts of the tax system. Which is why it's good to be talking about this now.
Yeah, exactly. So when we were thinking about writing this report, we were really thinking about two things, weren't we? One were this energy bills and the role they've played in the cost of living crisis. And sometimes when we talk about living standards, we think about income and prices. As an economist, we think kind of what really matters is incomes for living standards, and you can't, it's the job of the Bank of England to control prices. Don't worry about prices too much as policymakers, focus on income. But when we started to think about energy a bit more carefully, actually not only have they played this disproportionate role, it's also the case that you have variations in energy costs that aren't well correlated with income, so you can't target support just by looking at income. And then finally, actually, it's not an area where the government can say, like maybe food, well, prices are determined by the market and that's the best way to be. Really, government's playing this big role. So Johnny, just before I come back to Adam, what should we do about it then? What does your report tell us the government should do?
So we argue that we should look to fund some of these policies differently. And that boils down to moving them from the bill payer to the taxpayer. And these are the same people. So, it's moving costs from one part of your family budget to another part of your family budget. But the distribution of what that means for these budgets is very important. So as you sort of said, energy bills are very variable within sort of income ranges. You have lots of people on low incomes who use lots of energy through no fault of their own. They might have a big family, live in a badly insulated house. They might rent that house, so they've got no agency to improve it. But these people pay a lot towards these policies, whereas any sort of well-designed tax and benefit system would have people who are more likely to struggle with the cost of these policies paying less. So moving sort of, some of these sort of social policy, moving the social policy costs and some of the energy costs away from electricity bills, which is important for net zero, and onto the sort of tax system is a good way of easing some of that strain on low-income households.
And Adam, just before we dig into some of the details of that, why do you think we've ended up here with this kind of huge rise in costs? When I think about, let's imagine we're back in 2015 and the government had to announce, actually, we've got this tax on your energy bills and we're going to double it over the next 10 years. That doesn't feel like it would have gone down very well, but somehow we're here and it's happened.
There's a transparency issue as well. When you're exposing yourself to the jeopardy of those rises, the bill payers are very convenient, kind of hidden kind of way of funding what are strategic infrastructure choices and social welfare interventions. If it had been much more disaggregated and present, I don't think we would have done it. But it's an inflationary pressure, and what we also have to remember is not just how do we deal with this quantum of costs, many of which have to be paid for. I mean, they're not. It's not nebulous and they're not unnecessary. But we're not through the low carbon transition yet. There's a huge amount of grid reinforcement that's required. Will find its way onto the bill unless we have mechanisms to make it kind of otherwise. So one, it's just about the transparency and political jeopardy of being able to do this on the exchequer. And secondly, it's probably not knowing kind of how this was going to build and inflate and kind of build over a number of years. And Johnny's point for us is the absolutely critical one. Really nowhere near enough thought about the distributional impact of levying this on bill payers, all bill payers with a small amount of benefit that the low income households get through the warm home discount, which has gone up £10 in a decade. We've seen energy bills spiral. So there is an inflection point is needed where we go back and why are we doing these things? Which ones are necessary? Are these strategic government interventions or policy demands? Why are we doing it on the bill? Is there a more progressive way? I think there's general consensus that these policy costs should come off the bill and go on to general taxation, except for one bunch of people around the corner in the Treasury. And it's a fiscal argument we need to win, because I think it's been pretty much won across the charity sector, the NGO sector and the energy suppliers.
And I suppose the risk is that, as a former Treasury official, it sounds like what you're asking for is extra money or extra tax, but actually the spending is happening by the public sector in any case. The taxes are happening, they're just happening as levies on bills, which we try and call something that isn't taxation, but it's basically a thing that everyone has to pay and can't avoid, so it is a tax. And so really this is about how you tax to pay for these costs, not whether you do it.
And it's meeting strategic government objectives, which is to decarbonise the energy kind of supply system and to provide benefit to low-income households. So it's not just finding ways of enabling kind of greater levels of profitability or returns to energy companies. It's trying to achieve strategic government kind of objectives. And my big worry is one, the distribution impact, of course, but I've got no idea what the additional costs will be as we go through massive grid reinforcement. And unless we address that, even if you only address it for a certain cohort of low-income, struggling households, it might be too expensive across the board. Unless we do that, we're just stoking this energy bill inflation, even if fossil fuel volatility ebbs away.
Yeah. And so, Johnny, why don't you talk us through specifically, I think the really interesting thing you've done in this report is not just say, let's take these levies off bills, how much lower would bills be, but actually we do have to pay for that. Let's assume that goes on general taxation. What would the overall effect on households be? What do you find?
So to do that, we sort of figured out how much energy different types of households use and then how much they pay towards these costs. So some are a flat fee across all households. They're levied on the standing charge that everyone pays regardless of how much energy you use, but some are on what's called the unit charge, which is each little bit of energy you use. There's a little charge on that to pay for each little bit of policy that's funded in that way. And we sort of figured out what the sort of benefit to households would be if those costs were removed from the bill. And then how to pay for that basically. So if we spread that across those costs across the tax base, the wider tax base, rather than saying like this specific tax should rise to do that. We look at where we get all of our taxes from. We find that the distributional slant of the problem entirely changes. So instead of it being a thing where low-income households spend more of their income on paying for these things, to move the cost away would see low-income households gain more. The poorest fifth of households under what we are proposing would save more than £100 a year net of the tax increases to pay for it. A middle-income household would be about £40 a year better off. And nearly 3 in 4 would be net winners. So it seems like a good change if we're looking to not derail what we're doing with these policies and energy bills, to keep them going, because as I said they're quite important, but to pay for them in a way that is fairer.
And so the intuition, I guess, is that at the moment we've basically got a kind of flat cash tax. Actually slightly worse than that, because some of these vary according to how much energy you use, which can take up a larger proportion of low-income bills. But just to make it very simple, some of these are a sort of flat cash tax, which is inevitably regressive, and therefore if you funded it through the general tax system, which is progressive, you end up with a much improved distribution. And I guess we expected to find that, but I was quite struck by just how stark. It wasn't obvious to me whether the middle of the distribution would be better or off or not, but actually 3/4 of families end up better off, which is really, really stark. And I guess within those averages, families who use high energy and have low incomes, who are the families who've been particularly, as you say, Adam, had a tough time in the last few years and been stuck in the middle of these rising prices, would benefit in particular, which I guess would have wider benefits, just coming back to the issues you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, no, it definitely it definitely would do to take that. My questions would be, I think I'm absolutely supportive of the idea that policy costs should come off bills, not onto gas bills, because then you've got a problem of how you're really doing the distribution impact in the wrong way to the exchequer for lots of good reasons. Because the challenge of trying to continue to do this, of redistributing these costs across the bill payer base, is just kind of so difficult. How you do it through unit costs but don't hit low income, high using families, medical dependency, young children, older people, kind of how you do it in ways that are fair regionally. We have a bit of regional distribution kind of across the piece, and how you're able to do it and get benefit for those people who are in fuel poverty, not with mean tested benefits. So there's just a limitation to what you can do in trying to reshuffle the costs across the bill payer base. What it would also enable you to do is to get the argument away from just how you can reflect need through the energy bill and think about the other issues which are still stubborn, are going to be there. Getting the policy costs is much fairer, the redistribution is much better. Doesn't necessarily mean that bills are still affordable for people on the lowest income. So how do you deepen targeted support as opposed to going for some broad universal kind of benefit, and how do you deal with the fact, which hopefully government will address in its Warm Homes Plan at some stage, which is about the fact that if you're on a number of kind of low income, number deciles of deprivation, and you live in a very, very poorly insulated homes, it ain't going to make that much difference, because the challenge of keeping a home warm and healthy is not just constructed in fair construction of energy bills. Is about the lived environment. So it hopefully enables us to shift the focus and the argument to those other issues, having put to bed the inherent distributional unfairness that the way we construct energy bills.
Yeah, because there's so much going on for energy bills and energy policy at the moment, isn't there? And we've only really tackled one small aspect here. What do you think are the other big issues that are going to come up over the next couple of years?
And especially if we don't address the policy cost issues, it will be how you go from expedient but expensive, broad, shallow kind of benefits for everybody, electors as well as bill payers, into targeted support, and how you're able to identify those cohorts who may not be on means tested benefits but are clearly in absolute need. And the big one is going to be the Warm Homes Plan, what it means in terms of that infrastructural investment in homes to make them to reduce their carbon intensity, of course, through heat pumps, but also to address the fabric, which is just gonna, it just puts the kibosh on any attempt to make energy bills affordable if you're living in homes, especially if they're rented homes, which are just impossible to heat. So I think they remain the two big things: targeted support to make sure that affordable homes are a reality, not just better structured bills, and homes that become places of respite and comfort and joy and health, as opposed to dread and ill health. We need to get onto those two things, but it does feel like we have to address the structural inequalities and how we construct energy bills before we do that.
Yeah, really interesting. And maybe we should just pick up some of the other options people have floated that that actually, Johnny, you're saying are not kind of the first place you would go. One more obvious one is taking VAT off energy bills as a whole, or off electricity. That's not what you've recommended today. Do you want to tell us why?
So there's obviously cutting VAT would help bring bills down, but we think there are better ways of doing it, especially with the number of options in play. So with VAT, you would have a cost that was open-ended to the Treasury. So when it was doing its fiscal look-aheads, it could be tempted to undo that VAT reduction, push bills back up, or it could put pressure into other parts of its book balancing.
So this is just, sorry to interrupt, but this is an important point, right? Because as Adam says, it's maybe the Treasury we need to sell this to. So the costs that you've suggested, some of the costs that you've suggested moving into general taxation actually decline quite sharply through time, and so the cost to the exchequer would also decline quite sharply through time, whereas something like VAT is obviously a kind of source of revenue forever. So it feels like a bit of a win-win, where you could impact bills now but not really affect the long-term fiscal position.
Yeah, definitely. And then the other sort of core issue with VAT is we shouldn't really be looking to cut VAT on gas bills, because gas is, the price difference between electricity and gas is very important for getting people to buy electric cars, buy heat pumps, all things that households need to individually be incentivised to do to bring down national emissions. But if you only cut VAT on electricity bills, it would only bring bills down by £45 a year. So but putting yourself in that box, being like, VAT is fine, but just on electricity isn't going to wash when it comes to bringing bills down, especially as they're expected to go up again by £100 next spring.
Okay, well, look, thank you both so much for joining us. Really interesting. It sounds a bit like a system that's in quite a
mess. And I think, Adam, the point you made in particular, that we have to sort this out now, because it's only going to get more and more important as the years go on, will really stay with me. So thanks for joining us.